Hi everyone, thanks for coming. I'm here to advocate for the yes position. Before I dig into my presentation, I think the way this format is going to work is I'll give my presentation and then immediately after Samantha will give her presentation. So if you have questions for me, be sure to take notes on your laptop or write them down, because I'm sure by the time her presentation is over you will have completely forgotten what you want to ask me. So I'll start here with some introductions. As I told some of the people here today, I'm a former real estate developer. I am not subject to the tax that we're talking about today, nor would I have ever been subject to the tax that we're talking about today, because real estate's exempted. I am also a husband of a teacher. My wife's a teacher, and I have a son who's currently in kindergarten. So I don't have any personal interest in whether or not this capital gains tax stays in place. In fact, if it gets repealed, my wife, might not get her increase next year. So I've got everything to lose and nothing to gain by taking this position. The reason I'm taking this position is because I have certain principles and a pragmatic outlook on this policy that I think conflict with the nature of what's being proposed. And so throughout this presentation, I'm going to do a normative analysis of equity and ethics under the heading of principles, and I'm going to do a positive analysis of efficiency and efficacy under the heading of pragmatism. So, under equity of process, I want to talk a little bit about the concept of progressive taxation. So, it's a bit of an ambiguous statement to call a graduated tax system progressive. On one hand, what it means is that you're progressing from one income tax bracket to the next. And as you do so, as you make that progress, you're changing the tax rate based on income strata. So that's what progressive means. That's why it could also be called a graduated tax system. Some people kind of capitalize on that and also suggest that it's a socially progressive system. And I quite staunchly am opposed to the idea that it's a socially progressive system. I believe social progress is predicated on equity of process, not equity of outcome. And that process is predicated on consent. The example I often give for that is marijuana taxes. The idea that marijuana taxes and the legalization of marijuana is a regressive policy merely because people in a lower income strata pay a greater percentage of their income on marijuana, the logic breaks down. Progressive policy is progressive because it's consensual, not because it targets a particular income strata. We'll talk a little bit about equity of outcome. We'll look at the various income strata and what percentage of their incomes they pay in Washington State. We'll also look at what the net effect is of progressive taxation throughout the whole United States, and look at those two outcomes and compare them. And then under ethics, we'll talk about concepts of justice, and then the Washington State Constitution concept of consent. After this, we'll move on to pragmatism. Equity of process. So in my view, Washington has one of the most progressive tax systems in the union, and I'd like to keep it that way. And again, the reason is because progress is predicated on consent rather than coercion. We have luxury sales taxes, Pagovian taxes, rather than wealth taxes and graduated income taxes. And luxury sales tax are progressive because if you find yourself in a hardship, you lose your job, whatever it might be, buy less alcohol, buy less marijuana, buy less prepared food. We don't tax groceries in Washington State. We don't tax prescriptions in Washington State. It's a voluntary tax system. You can pay taxes when you can afford it. You can stop paying taxes when you don't. So that is my characterization of the Washington State tax system. Taxes on alcohol and tobacco generated $1.46 billion between 2017 and 2019. Between the two of them, that's more than sufficient to cover the $500 million call for education. But instead, these funds are put into the general fund. So these taxes were originally passed in an effort to incentivize people to drink less alcohol and to smoke less tobacco. They didn't earmark money for anything, just spend it on whatever they want to spend it on annually. I'm suggesting that we take some of that money and we allocate it towards education instead of implementing coercive tax systems. Again, legalization of marijuana is progressive victory, not a regressive tax. The other example that I like to give is prohibition. So before 1913, before the income tax structure on the federal government level, the federal government derived 90% of its revenue from taxes on tobacco and alcohol. Okay? After the income tax passed, the federal government was no longer reliant on the taxes from tobacco and alcohol. 7 years later, they banned alcohol. Okay? So when the government has a monetary incentive to maintain your rights to partake in these substances, it is much more difficult for the government to ban them. Okay? And so marijuana, for example, your right to partake in marijuana is much more tenuous under a government that has a coercive tax system based on income taxes and wealth taxes relative to progressive consent-based taxes. So again, I also want to talk a little bit about the process for deciding who pays the income tax or the capital gains tax in this case and who doesn't. So the small businesses, you'll see my counterpart claim that small businesses are exempted from the tax. Only certain kinds of small businesses are exempted from the tax. Real estate development, that's my lobby. Okay. Auto dealers and commercial fishers are all exempted from the tax. And the reason these people are exempted from the tax is because they have a better lobby than the people who aren't. You got small tech startups, people who build businesses for a living and turn around and sell them, and that's their income stream. Contracting businesses. I have a really close colleague of mine who I worked with for, oh gosh, probably a decade. He owns a local plumbing business. I'm not going to name names to protect his anonymity, but he contracted cancer, and he was forced to sell his business because he couldn't work it anymore. And you know, gosh, it's just such a kick in the face to have to pay 7% of what you worked 20 years of your life to build because you got cancer. So we used to call this tyranny, but now we call it progress. And it's very frustrating. Talk about equity of outcome a little bit. So this is often what's portrayed as the regressive tax structure of Washington State. You've got lower income strata paying a greater percentage of their income relative to higher income strata. Often what is not placed alongside this graph is the share of the income tax paid by higher income strata. So if you look at the top 10% here, as far as income strata goes, you'll notice that they pay about 75% of all federal taxes. So in other words, if you're in the top 10%, you're going to accept 75% of the federal tax burden. Okay, so I don't know any other arena in which that's considered equitable. 75% of the burden going to 10% of the population. The impact of Washington State's current tax structure is more equitable, it's more even distribution. Now, you know, could we tax things like boats, other consent-based luxury taxes to help make this a little bit more equitable? Sure. But this is not the answer. This is inequity. An unjust law is a code that a majority inflicts on a minority that is not binding on itself. This is difference made legal. Does anybody know where this concept of justice comes from? Martin Luther King. Proponents of the capital gains tax brag about their injustice as though it's a feature. Fewer than 4,000 people paid the capital gains tax in Washington. How do they defend it? Proponents of capital gains taxes and graduated income taxes use dehumanizing speech to marginalize their targets. Mega millionaires, the 1%, the wealthy, bourgeoisie. My personal favorite, Wall Street. As if a street can pay taxes. Way to objectify people. This elicits prejudice and conjures pejorative images of the wealthy elite capitalist class straining the working classes of all their money. Now maybe you agree with this image, but personally I conceive that this image is prejudice. Rarely, if ever, are taxpayers referred to as people. Only 1.6% of people in the 1% stay there for longer than 5 years. Most of them are business owners who sell a business 1 year or sell a piece of real estate when they drop out of that income bracket later on. And about 1 in 10 Americans will be in the 1% for at least 1 year. So we're not talking about some fixed class of people that's oppressing everyone. We're talking about all of us. Another concept of ethics also espoused by Martin Luther King is an unjust law is a code that is inflicted upon a minority which that minority had no part in enacting or creating because it did not have the unhampered right to vote. Additionally, all political power is inherent to the people. Governments derive their just powers from the governed, as the Washington State Constitution. And then, of course, no taxation without representation. We all know where that one comes from. People paying capital gains tax do not live in the local districts in which the schools decide how these money are spent. And so, in other words, you're drawing funds from a person and not giving them any opportunity to vote on the way their dollars are spent in those individual districts. So, taxation without representation. The number of ways that's unethical is listed here. You might note the local property taxes. I call those kind of purple taxes as opposed to on the consent and coercive spectrum. And the reason is because property taxes are no doubt more coercive than than sales taxes, like sales taxes. But when you draw property taxes from local districts and spend it on schools, there's positive externalities associated with those taxes. Home values rise. So even if you don't have kids in that district, you still derive a benefit from the school system. So, you know, as a purple tax goes, that one is a little bit more justifiable. So, you know, a lot of you, I've seen some of the looks on your faces. You might say, gosh, Kobe, I don't believe in your libertarian principles. And Martin Luther King was talking about racism, not classism. Those aren't the same thing. Eat the rich. And, you know, maybe that's the case, but I've also got some pragmatic points to make here about the tax system. I do want to make a note here. Proponents of the capital gains tax claim that if we repeal it, we're defunding the school system. It's completely not true. There's a constitutional mandate to fund the school system. The only thing that we're actually discussing today is how we fund that school system and how we spend the money. So I will talk about where the money comes from and how it's funded, and then I'll talk about how efficiently it's spent. But my characterization of this, again, is I am a big supporter of education. I fully believe, and I'm in line with the Washington State Constitution, that we pay for education. The problem I have with this bill is the way that it's funded and the way that it's spent. The revenue threshold contemplated by RCW 82 is about $500 million listed in that section. And between 2023 and 2024, the revenue derived from this tax fell from $896 million to $433 million. So you'll know my counterpart here will note that we earned $896 million first year, that's true. Second year, we've dropped below the threshold. It took 1 year to drop below the threshold. That's not a very effective tax in my book. The reason that we dropped so far is I mean, multivariable. We can't point to any one reason. But taxes at higher income strata tend to be more elastic. In other words, people with a lot of money have a greater ability to avoid the tax. They buy second houses. They move out of state for 6 months out of the year. They move their businesses to other states and continue to live here. It takes time to sort out what those loopholes are. And so as those loopholes get sorted out, the tax revenue drops. Moreover, will capital flight, the idea that people flee the state because they have to pay 7% on capital gains, that's generally an overstated argument in my opinion. But because this tax affects only 4,000 people, they don't need to leave the state because of the capital gains tax. The net effect is they just have to leave the state. Bezos left because he wanted to be with his family. It didn't have anything to do with the tax, but we're still going to collect less because Bezos left. So the low number of people is not a feature of the bug. It will cause this tax to be ineffective. Because this tax is unstable and we're approving a tax that's predicated on coercion, we've now given the state a license to coercively tax other people in the state to support a less elastic tax base. That's all of us. I would rather pay a higher alcohol tax to fund the school system than I would have my income tax. Efficiency of the school system. So I do want to disclose something here. All of these charts came from the Washington State Republican website, okay? And, you know, I've checked most of their numbers to the best of my ability. This is not a peer-reviewed presentation. I will note that there is one number on the handout that I gave that is incorrect. It says that private schools cost 40%, excuse me, public school costs 40% more than private school. It's actually 30%. The place I originally got this number was from the same website. The Republicans used the cost of private school for elementary, not for elementary and high school. So I've corrected that in this presentation. The reason I bring that up is because, you know, these might be a little deceptive, but I did the best I could to verify these numbers. Funding has increased over time for the Washington State system. Performance has continued to decline. We spend about $18,354 per student. We only have 18 charter schools. The total annual cost of the system, you'll note, at just about a little under $40 billion. I guess $1 billion under $40 billion. It's all relative. $39 billion. Suppose we wanted the 1% to pay for the whole thing, you know, tax the rich. Well, Washington State school system would bankrupt Bill Gates in less than 5 years. It would bankrupt Elon Musk in less than 10. Okay, 1% of the population is not going to pay for this system. We all have to pay for this system, and the state knows that. So consider that when you're voting for taxes that you think aren't going to impact. As far as efficiency of the school system goes, these are the national rankings of our school system. Second for starting teacher salary, fifth for average salary, and then of course all our performance metrics are down towards the bottom. How would I rather see our money on the school system spent is private schools. Again, I've corrected this number here. Was 13,000 is what the Republicans suggest. It's actually 14,000, and I got that by taking the high school cost and the elementary cost and blending them together. which is the same way that the other number was derived. Despite the lower price of private schools tend to outperform public schools in Washington. The same is true of charter schools. Moreover, people in BIPOC communities tend to perform better in charter schools because they have more flexibility. They can respond to cultural sensitivities and needs at a much better rate than the centralized, standardized public school system.
Do you have any numbers on that?
That's my source. You can have it in the presentation. I'll send it to you. Education is critically important, but we need to be cognizant of the way that it's provided, the way that it's funded, and the way that we spend our money. We want to get the most bang for our buck, and the capital gains tax as conceived does not do that. In conclusion, the capital gains taxes are inequitable, they're unethical, they're ineffective, they're inefficient, and I hope that you vote with me in favor of I-2109. Thank you.